The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the dense forest that stretched endlessly beneath it. An eerie silence filled the air, only broken by the occasional rustle of wind through the treetops. The night felt still, as though the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something was about to happen, something that had been foretold in the whispers of the wind, in the murmur of the river, in the stories passed down from generation to generation. A night was coming. Sir Lyle was a man of few words, but his presence spoke volumes. Standing tall and broad, with weathered armour that bore the marks of countless battles, he had become something of a legend in the kingdom. With the rise of every new threat to the realm, Sir Lyle was called upon. His name was synonymous with courage, with victory, with the kind of heroism that songs were written about. Yet, in the quiet of the night, as he rode through the darkened woods, he felt no thrill of excitement, no surge of adrenaline that usually came with such missions. Instead, he felt a gnawing uncertainty deep within his chest, a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. This was not the first time he had been summoned to slay a dragon, but this was different. The messenger had not spoken of a vicious beast, a monster laying waste to villages. No, the message had been simple. A dragon has taken residence in the northern mountains. You must slay it. What bothered Sir Lyle most was the absence of detail. No description of the dragon's behaviour, no mention of its size or ferocity, just the command to kill. And that in itself was troubling. His hand gripped the reins tighter, his horse's hooves muffled against the soft earth beneath them. It was a journey he had made countless times before, travelling to remote places, facing threats that could tear a kingdom apart. But this time, something in the air felt different. The weight of the silence was oppressive, as though the trees themselves were watching him, waiting. What was it that had called him here? Why had he been summoned to this particular mountain to confront this particular dragon? The land around him grew more desolate as he ventured deeper into the wilderness. The forest thinned, the trees becoming sparse and twisted. The rocky terrain soon gave way to steep cliffs, and in the distance he could see the looming silhouette of the mountain. His destination. At the foot of the mountain, Sir Lyle dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the loose gravel. The cold air nipped at his skin, and he tightened his cloak around himself, staring upward. The mountain was jagged and foreboding, the peaks cloaked in mist. Somewhere beyond the clouds, the dragon waited. And as he started his climb, something strange stirred in his chest. A strange ache, a dull throb that he couldn't explain. This was the part of the journey he knew best. The climb, the danger, the final confrontation. But tonight, the mountain felt like a place of reckoning, a place where something long buried would rise again. Sir Lyle had been a knight for as long as he could remember, and for most of his life he had lived under the banner of duty. His father, a knight before him, had taught him that honour was the only thing worth pursuing. His mother had whispered of the dragons that once roamed the skies, of the great battles fought, of the heroes who had risen to protect the kingdom. But she had never told him that a knight's greatest battle would not be against monsters, but against the ghosts of his own past. As Sir Lyle made his way up the mountain, the wind began to howl, carrying with it an almost sorrowful cry, as though the mountain itself were mourning. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, the cold steel comforting against his palm. He had fought many beasts, faced many horrors, but this felt different. The stories of dragons were so old, so faded in the minds of men. Had they not been driven away long ago, or had they simply gone into hiding, waiting for the day when they would rise again? And yet, something in his heart told him that this dragon was not like the others. There was something familiar about this task, something that connected him to it in a way he couldn't explain. At the summit, he found it. The dragon was not the fierce beast he had imagined, a towering terror of scales and fire. No, the dragon before him was an old creature, its scales worn and dulled by the passage of time, its eyes heavy with centuries of memories. It lay curled upon a bed of rocks, the very image of exhaustion. The mountain was silent, save for the wind, and for a long moment Sir Lyle simply stared at the dragon, unsure of what to do. The creature's massive form shifted, and it lifted its head, gazing at Sir Lyle with eyes that were ancient and knowing. "Why have you come?" the dragon asked, its voice a low rumble that seemed to echo in Sir Lyle's chest. He froze. His heart skipped a beat, and his sword, once steady in his hand, felt suddenly too heavy to hold. "You are the dragon I was sent to slay," Sir Lyle said, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. The dragon's eyes softened. "Are you sure?" it asked, its voice tinged with sadness. Sir Lyle frowned. "What do you mean? I've been sent to destroy you. It is my duty." The dragon tilted its head, as though contemplating something long forgotten. Slowly, it unfolded its wings, revealing scars and wariness that had been hidden beneath its massive form. "And if I told you I was no enemy of yours, what would you do then?" The words hung in the air between them, and Sir Lyle's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" he whispered, his grip tightening on the sword. The dragon lowered its head, a deep sigh escaping its chest. "I'm no enemy, Sir Lyle. I was once your friend." And in that moment, the knight's world unravelled. The dragon's words echoed through his mind, and his body went still. He blinked, his sword suddenly feeling as though it were made of lead. The wind howled louder now, as if the mountain itself were bearing witness to the revelation. "Your friend?" Sir Lyle managed, his voice breaking with disbelief. He stared into the dragon's eyes, and for the first time he saw something he had not expected. Recognition. Recognition of something long buried, something that stirred deep within him. And suddenly the past came rushing back, a flood of memories that had been locked away for so long. The dragon's words hung in the air like a thick fog, confusing and disorienting Sir Lyle. The mountainside was silent, save for the eerie howl of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder in the far-off sky. For a moment the knight could not move, could not breathe, as his mind tried to make sense of what he had just heard. His sword, once steady and reliable, now felt alien in his grip. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief and dread. Your friend?" Sir Lyle repeated, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He stared at the dragon, whose golden eyes now seemed to study him with a deep, ancient sorrow. His heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. "What do you mean?" he whispered, barely able to voice the question. The dragon, despite its size and power, appeared fragile. It shifted on the rocky ground, the creaking sound of its wings drawing the knight's attention. Each motion seemed painful, as though the weight of years, centuries even, bore down on the creature's soul. "I knew you once, Sir Lyle," the dragon said, its voice no longer a rumble but a soft whisper, laden with regret. "We fought side by side. We were brothers in arms, bound by honour and friendship. But time changes everything, doesn't it?" Sir Lyle's mind spun, his memories rushing to the surface like a flood he could not stop. He closed his eyes and tried to grasp at the fleeting images that flitted through his mind. An old battlefield, the sound of clashing swords, and a figure standing beside him, tall and proud, wings spread wide, fire in its eyes. But the memories slipped away as quickly as they came, leaving only fragments, nothing concrete, nothing to hold on to. "Impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "This cannot be. I would remember, I would." The dragon's golden eyes softened with sadness. "Would you?" it asked quietly. "Or has the memory of our friendship been buried under the weight of duty, the armour you wear, the sword you wield? I see the man you have become, Sir Lyle, the knight, but I remember the boy you once were, the one who would laugh and play in the meadows, the one who would sit with me by the fireside and talk about dreams. We were young once." The knight's heart clenched at the words. He didn't want to believe it. He couldn't. How could this beast, this monstrous ancient creature, be the same friend he had once known? A friend who had been by his side through the wars of his youth? The thought was too much to bear. The years of battles, the years of being a knight, of fighting for a kingdom that demanded loyalty without question, had it all erased his past? "Who are you?" Sir Lyle choked out, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "Who do you claim to be?" The dragon closed its eyes as though gathering strength for something it had to say. "I am Azeroth," it said, each syllable of its name reverberating in the cold air around them. "Do you remember that name, Sir Lyle?" Azeroth. The name pierced through the fog of Sir Lyle's mind like a sharp blade. Azeroth. A name that had been buried in the deep recesses of his memories, a name he had long forgotten. The memories came rushing back, vivid and raw, of a time before the war, before the bloodshed. A time when he and Azeroth had been inseparable, brothers not by blood but by bond, a bond forged in the fires of their shared dreams and aspirations. He had been young then, naive even, but there was something pure in his heart. He had believed in the world, in the possibility of peace. Azeroth had been there, a constant companion, a creature of immense power but gentle at heart. They had fought battles, but not for conquest. No, they had fought to protect, to defend the helpless. And then, things had changed. Time had moved on, and the world they had once known had crumbled beneath the weight of politics, greed, and war. Azeroth had disappeared. Sir Lyle had gone on to become a knight, to protect a kingdom that had slowly corrupted him. The memories flooded back in waves, overwhelming him, threatening to break him. The laughter, the camaraderie, the promises of a future that would never come. All of it was slipping away again, like as if the very act of remembering was tearing him apart. "You left," Sir Lyle said, his voice thick with emotion. "You left me, you disappeared, we fought side by side, and then you were gone, and I was alone." Azeroth's head dropped, and for a moment the dragon looked as though it were ashamed. "I had to leave, Sir Lyle," it said softly. "The world, it was changing. There were forces at work that neither of us could have stopped. I could not remain in the world you had chosen. It was too dangerous. You were becoming something I could not follow, and I could not bear to watch you lose yourself." Sir Lyle's chest tightened. The words hit him harder than any blow he had ever received. He had always believed that Azeroth had abandoned him, had left him to fight alone. But now here was the truth. Azeroth had stayed away, not because he had chosen to, but because he had been afraid for Sir Lyle's soul. "Then why have you come back?" Sir Lyle asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. His voice cracked, raw with years of suppressed pain. "Why now, after all these years? Why now, when I've become this night?" The dragon opened its eyes again, its gaze full of regret. "I did not come to fight you, Sir Lyle. I did not come to destroy. I came because I could not bear to see you, my friend, fall any further into the abyss. You have become a weapon, a tool of destruction for a kingdom that does not deserve your loyalty." The knight's knees weakened, and he staggered backward, his breath coming in harsh gasps. The weight of Azeroth's words crashed down on him like a tidal wave, drowning him in guilt and sorrow. He had become a knight, had given everything to the kingdom, only to realize that the kingdom was not worth his sacrifice. And now, here was Azeroth, a creature of unimaginable power, asking him to make a choice. "Then what do you want from me?" Sir Lyle demanded, his voice raw with emotion. "What do you expect me to do? I am nothing without this armor, this sword. I am nothing without my duty." Azeroth's eyes softened again, and for the first time the dragon looked vulnerable. "You are more than that, Lyle. You always have been. You have the power to choose who you will be. You have the power to return to the man you once were, to choose a different path. But that choice must come from you." The knight was silent, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision that loomed before him. Would he remain the knight, the weapon of the kingdom, or would he step away from the role he had been given and return to the man he had once been? The choice seemed impossible, yet it was the only one that truly mattered. And so, under the cold gaze of the mountain and the watchful eyes of the dragon, Sir Lyle stood on the precipice of his past and his future, unsure of which path to take, but knowing that the decision he made now would define him forever. The night air hung thick with tension, the wind now howling as though the mountain itself had become restless. Sir Lyle stood frozen in front of Azeroth, the weight of the dragon's revelation settling in his chest. His mind raced, his thoughts fighting against each other, old memories clashing with his sense of duty, his loyalty to a kingdom that had abandoned him long ago. What had he become? What could he possibly do now, with everything he had ever known hanging in the balance? But as if the mountain itself could sense his indecision, a sudden tremor shook the ground beneath his feet, snapping Sir Lyle from his trance. The rocks around them shifted, and a loud, deep growl echoed through the air, low and rumbling, like the growl of a beast preparing to strike. "What's happening?" Sir Lyle whispered, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. Azeroth's golden eyes flickered with urgency, and he rose to his full height, his wings unfurling with a tremendous gust of wind. "There's no time to explain," the dragon rumbled. "Something is coming, and we must face it together." Before Sir Lyle could respond, the ground shook again, this time more violently. Large stones began to roll down the mountainside, and the air grew thick with dust. The sound of something large, very large, moving through the forest below them reached Sir Lyle's ears, and the dragon's expression darkened. "We are not alone," Azeroth growled, his voice tinged with warning. "Enemies have followed us. They must have sensed my presence. We cannot let them reach the mountain." The knight's heart raced. His fingers tightened around his sword as the echoes of thunder rumbled in the distance. What enemies could have followed him to this remote place? What threat was now descending upon them? With a swift motion, Sir Lyle mounted his horse, his sword now drawn. His armour creaked as he prepared for battle. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice urgent. Azeroth's eyes met his, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "You must fight, Sir Lyle, but you must also trust me. We fight as one." The ground trembled again, and from the shadows of the dense forest, figures began to emerge. The first thing Sir Lyle noticed was the sharp glint of steel, the low growl of guttural voices. Strange figures appeared from the trees, humanoid shapes with dark, twisted faces and bodies covered in jagged armour. Their eyes burned with an unnatural, almost feral glow. Azeroth flared his wings, his massive form blocking the path between the approaching enemies and Sir Lyle. The knight felt the dragon's presence like a wall of protection, unseen, yet undeniable. But the threat was too great, and there were too many. The figures closed in, their movements fast and deliberate. Their armour clattered as they advanced, and the air was filled with the smell of iron and something else, something rancid, as though the very creatures themselves had been corrupted by dark magic. "Who are they?" Sir Lyle asked, his voice low, eyes scanning the oncoming foes. Azeroth's gaze darkened further. "They are the Shadowborn, creatures twisted by dark forces long ago. They were once human, but their souls were corrupted by the same powers that sought to control me. They will stop at nothing to destroy me, and you, if you stand in their way." Sir Lyle's breath caught in his throat. Shadowborn. He had heard rumours of them in passing, whispered tales of men and women who had sold their souls for power, but he never imagined they were real. And now here they were, closing in. The dragon's great wings beat the air, sending gusts of wind crashing into the approaching enemies. Azeroth's voice rang out like a thunderclap. "Stay close, Sir Lyle! Don't let them surround us!" The knight gripped his sword tighter and spurred his horse forward, the beast galloping into the fray. He met the first Shadowborn with a crash of steel, his sword slicing through the air. The creature staggered back with a growl, but it quickly regained its footing, charging forward with unnatural speed. Sir Lyle parried its strike just in time, feeling the heat of its cursed blade on his own. Behind him, Azeroth roared, his massive form crashing into the enemies with the force of a tempest. He swept through the Shadowborn ranks with terrifying efficiency, his claws tearing through their twisted armour like parchment. The ground beneath them trembled with each strike, the force of the dragon's power sending shockwaves that knocked enemies off their feet. Sir Lyle fought with every ounce of strength he had, each strike a testament to his training, each movement calculated and precise. But as the battle raged on, the knight felt something unfamiliar creeping into his thoughts. The Shadowborn, though dangerous, weren't the only threat. As his sword clashed against theirs, Sir Lyle could see that their numbers were growing, pouring in from the trees like a flood of darkness. Azeroth was fighting valiantly, but the dragon, despite his size and power, was not invincible. The knight could see the toll the battle was taking on the creature. His movements slowed, his breaths growing ragged as more Shadowborn surrounded him. The great beast was being overwhelmed. "Azeroth!" Sir Lyle shouted, fear creeping into his voice. "We can't hold them off much longer. We need a plan." The dragon growled in frustration, swinging his tail through a group of Shadowborn. "There is no time for plans, Lyle. We must fight as if it is our last battle. I can hold them off for only so long, then we must retreat to the mountain. There, I can protect us for a time, but we must be quick." But just as Sir Lyle was about to respond, a loud crack split the air. The ground beneath their feet trembled again. and from the shadows emerged a new figure, one more terrifying than the others, a towering shadowborn, larger than any of the others, with blackened wings that stretched wide enough to blot out the moonlight. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, fiery red light, and its very presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air. Sir Lyle froze in terror. "What is that?" Azeroth's voice, strained and desperate, rumbled in the knight's ear. "That is their leader, the Warden of the Shadowborn. If we don't stop him, we are finished." The Warden's gaze fixed on Sir Lyle, a malicious grin spreading across its twisted face. It raised a wicked, jagged sword in the air, and the other Shadowborn parted to give it room to advance. Azeroth let out a fierce roar, his wings flapping violently, but it was clear that the dragon was too exhausted, too worn to fight the Warden alone. The leader's power was far greater than any of the others. In that moment, Sir Lyle realised something terrifying. This battle was no longer about saving the kingdom. It was about survival, about stopping a force that could end everything. And it seemed that the past and present had collided on this mountain, leaving him with no choice but to face the darkness that was coming for them both. The battle raged on, a cacophony of steel crashing against steel, the air thick with the stench of blood and fire. Sir Lyle's breath came in ragged gasps, each swing of his sword feeling heavier than the last. His armour felt like it was made of lead, every movement a struggle. The Shadowborn were relentless, and their leader, the Warden, towered above them all like a harbinger of doom. With every step he took, the ground seemed to crack under his feet, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light that burned with malice. Azeroth was in the thick of it, his great wings slashing through the air, his claws tearing through enemy ranks with terrifying power. But even the mighty dragon seemed to be faltering. His breaths were shallow, his movements slower with each passing moment. The weight of the battle was taking its toll on him. Sir Lyle fought fiercely, his heart pounding in his chest, but the truth was undeniable. He couldn't hold his ground alone, and neither could Azeroth. The Warden's power was far beyond anything they had ever faced. With each clash, Sir Lyle's doubt grew heavier. He had always been a knight, a protector of the realm. He had spent years fighting for a kingdom that had never truly valued him. But now, standing side by side with the dragon, he realised that the real battle was here. In this moment, between the darkness that sought to destroy them and the light they both still clung to. "Azeroth!" Sir Lyle shouted over the roar of the battle. "We can't keep fighting like this. We need to end it now." The dragon's golden eyes flashed, a mixture of determination and exhaustion in his gaze. "I know, Lyle, but the Warden, he's too powerful. We cannot defeat him head on." As if on cue, the Warden swung his sword, the blade slicing through the air with a sound like thunder. Sir Lyle barely managed to raise his sword in time, the blow crashing into him with a force that sent him tumbling backward, pain shooting through his body. His shield clattered to the ground, and he was left sprawled on the rocky terrain, his head spinning, his vision blurring. The Warden loomed over him, a terrifying shadow casting its dark, dark presence over the night. "You cannot win," the Warden growled, his voice low and guttural, the air crackling with dark energy. "This world belongs to those who bend the will of others, and you are nothing but a puppet in their hands. I will break you just as I broke your friend." Sir Lyle struggled to rise, his hands trembling as he pushed himself up. The Warden's words echoed in his mind, but they only fueled his resolve. Azeroth had been right. The battle was never about kingdoms, never about honour. It was about freedom. It was about protecting what remained of their souls in a world that had already been consumed by darkness. With a growl, Sir Lyle forced himself to his feet, his sword raised once more. But his strength was waning. His body felt like it was made of stone, every movement sluggish. The Warden's dark power was overwhelming, and it seemed that no matter how hard he fought, it wasn't enough. He needed something more, something he didn't know he had inside of him. A sharp, strangled cry pierced the air. Azeroth was in trouble. The dragon's mighty wings flapped desperately, but the Shadowborn swarmed around him, their dark blades striking again and again. The Warden raised his sword, ready to deliver a final fatal blow. "Azeroth!" Sir Lyle shouted, his voice hoarse with desperation. His heart pounded in his chest as the realization struck him. If he didn't act now, they would both be lost. A surge of energy, pure and raw, erupted from somewhere deep within Sir Lyle, something he hadn't known was there, something that had been buried beneath years of duty and conflict. His sword pulsed with a strange, unfamiliar power, a golden light radiating from its blade. He didn't understand it, but he didn't question it either. With a roar of defiance, Sir Lyle charged at the warden, his sword raised high. The warden sneered, his twisted smile spreading wider as he swung his own blade down toward the knight, but Sir Lyle was faster. With a movement fueled by sheer will, Sir Lyle thrust his sword forward. It struck the warden's blade, the force of the collision sending shockwaves through the air. But it wasn't just the sword that struck. It was something more. The golden light from Sir Lyle's sword exploded outward in a blinding flash, enveloping the warden in its intensity. The warden howled in agony, his dark powers flickering, wavering under the strength of the light. Sir Lyle pressed forward, his determination growing with each passing second. He felt the energy within him surge, filling him with the strength he thought he had lost. This was the moment. This was the choice he had to make. The choice to fight not for duty, but for himself, for Azeroth, for everything he had once believed in. Azeroth's voice, strained and weak, reached him through the chaos. "Lyle, you have to finish it. You are the key." The words rang through him like a bell, clearing the fog of doubt that had clouded his mind. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, could feel the weight of the years bearing down on him. But it didn't matter. He couldn't let it win. Not now. Not after everything. With a final desperate push, Sir Lyle drove his sword deep into the warden's chest. The dark energy erupted around them, the warden's body jerking violently, his screams filling the air. Sir Lyle's hand shook, his grip tight on the hilt of his sword as the warden crumpled to the ground, his twisted form collapsing into a heap of shadow and ash. The battle stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The Shadowborn, leaderless and disoriented, faltered. Azeroth, wounded but still standing, roared in victory, his wings flapping in the air with renewed strength. Sir Lyle stood over the fallen warden, his sword still embedded in the creature's chest. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His body was battered, bruised and broken, but his spirit was unyielding. The dark presence that had threatened to swallow them both, was gone, vanquished by the strength of his own will. For a moment, there was silence. Then Azeroth's voice, filled with gratitude, broke the stillness. "You did it, Lyle. You truly did it." Sir Lyle lowered his sword, breathing heavily, his eyes meeting the dragon's. "We did it," he said quietly, the weight of the battle still pressing on him, but the truth settling in his chest. He hadn't just fought for the kingdom, for a crown, or for honour. He had fought for himself. And in that moment, he knew he had found something more precious than any victory. Azeroth dipped his head, his golden eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Thank you, my friend, for everything." The knight smiled, though it was a weary, bittersweet smile. "No, Azeroth, thank you for reminding me who I truly am." As the last of the Shadowborn fled into the night, Sir Lyle and Azeroth stood together on the mountainside, knowing that the battle was over. But the real journey, one of healing, redemption and understanding, was just beginning. The battle was over, the air still humming with the energy of the final confrontation. As the last of the Shadowborn scattered into the night, their dark forms vanishing into the hills, Sir Lyle stood, his body heavy with exhaustion. His sword, now stained with the warden's dark blood, was still clutched in his hand, but his grip was loosening, his fingers trembling. Azeroth, who had collapsed onto the rocky ground beside him, let out a low, painful growl, the wounds on his wings still raw and bleeding. His breath came in slow, laboured gasps, and his eyes, once fierce with the fire of battle, now flickered with fatigue. "You're hurt," Sir Lyle said softly, his voice strained but filled with concern. His heart twisted at the sight of his old friend, his companion, so vulnerable. The dragon's once glorious wings were now marred with deep gouges, and his scales, usually shimmering with gold and bronze, were dull with exhaustion. "It's nothing," Azeroth said, though his voice was weak, barely above a whisper. "We won, didn't we? That's all that matters." But Sir Lyle could see the truth. The dragon was far from okay. He knew the cost of battle all too well, the toll it took on the body, the soul. But there was no time to dwell on it now. They had won, yes, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, silvery light over the rocky terrain. The sounds of battle had faded, but the silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. The weight of what they had just done, what they had survived, pressed down on them both. "Where do we go from here?" Sir Lyle murmured, more to himself than to Azeroth. The question lingered in the stillness of the night, unanswered. Azeroth stirred, pushing himself up with a grunt. "We leave. We go back. There's nothing left here now, nothing but ash and ruin." Sir Lyle turned his gaze to the horizon, where the dark outline of the mountain loomed against the night sky. The land, once filled with the tension of impending doom, now felt strangely peaceful. It was a peace that came after a great storm, the calm that followed the chaos. But it was a fragile peace, one that could shatter with the slightest breeze. "I thought we were fighting for something bigger," Sir Lyle said, his voice tinged with doubt. "I thought. You thought this was about kingdoms, honour and glory?" Azeroth interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "No, Lyle, it was never about that. It was about survival, about keeping something alive inside of us, something that the darkness can't touch." Sir Lyle fell silent, the weight of those words settling heavily in his chest. For the first time in years, he understood what the dragon had meant. It wasn't about the battles they fought, or the victories they claimed. It was about the fight for what remained of their souls. "I don't know what's next," Sir Lyle said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "But I think I'm finally ready to find out." Azeroth's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, the dragon's eyes shone with a deep, unspoken understanding. He had been through more battles than Sir Lyle could count, and he knew that this moment, this silence between them, was something they both needed, something that spoke of the bond they had forged through fire and blood. "You're not alone, Lyle," Azeroth said, his voice calm but full of strength. "We'll figure it out together." The words felt like a weight lifting off Sir Lyle's shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Azeroth rose to his feet, his wings still drooping, but his posture strong. "We need to find shelter for the night. You've got wounds of your own that need tending to." Sir Lyle nodded, though he didn't feel much pain. It was the emotional exhaustion that weighed on him more than anything. His body, bruised and battered, was nothing compared to the heaviness in his heart, but he didn't mind. The battle was over. The warden was gone. And though the night was far from peace, he knew that, in some strange way, the worst was behind them. Together, they moved slowly, walking through the mountain pass that had once been filled with the chaos of battle. The terrain was now eerily quiet. The only sound, the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a night bird. It was almost as if the land itself had taken a deep breath, finally at peace after the storm. As they made their way to a small cave hidden among the rocks, Sir Lyle couldn't help but reflect on everything that had led them to this moment. The years of loneliness, the battles fought, the secrets they had uncovered. And through it all, the one thing that had remained constant was Azeroth, the dragon who had been his ally, his friend, his brother in arms. "You know, Lyle," Azeroth said, breaking the silence as they reached the entrance to the cave. "I've spent so many years alone, hiding away from the world. I thought that was the way it had to be. But then you came along, and for the first time, I realised that there's something worth fighting for." Sir Lyle's gaze softened as he looked at his companion. I'm glad you didn't give up," he said quietly. Azeroth gave a small, wry smile, though it was tinged with wariness. "I think I'd have been lost without you, Lyle. You've been my anchor." The knight chuckled softly, though the sound was hollow, as if it didn't quite reach his heart. He didn't have the words to express the depth of his gratitude, how much he had come to rely on the dragon's wisdom, strength, and companionship. They entered the cave, settling down to rest for the night. Sir Lyle cleaned and bandaged the worst of his wounds, though the cuts were shallow and mostly forgotten in the wake of the larger conflict. He glanced over at Azeroth, who was lying against the cave wall, his great wings folded at his sides. "What now?" Sir Lyle asked, his voice barely a whisper. Azeroth closed his eyes, a soft, contented sigh escaping his lips. "We rest. And then we find the next battle, the next chapter, together." Sir Lyle leaned back, closing his eyes as well. the sounds of the night wrapping around them like a blanket. There would be more battles, more journeys, but for now they were both content in the quiet, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it side by side. The world outside had been torn apart, but in that small cave, the bond between knight and dragon was unbreakable, and that was enough. The night passed in a tranquil silence that neither Sir Lyle nor Azeroth had experienced for years. The constant hum of tension that had shadowed their every step was gone, replaced by an uneasy peace that lay thick in the cool air. They had survived. And yet there was a lingering question that neither of them dared to speak aloud. What now? The first rays of the sun crept through the entrance of the cave, casting long shadows that stretched across the stone floor. Sir Lyle was the first to stir. His body ached from the battle, but the pain was not unbearable. His mind, however, was restless, wandering between the past and the future, between what they had lost and what they still had left. Azeroth was already awake, his golden eyes gleaming softly in the morning light. Despite his injuries, the dragon was alert, his senses still sharp. He was a creature of the wild, of the skies and the earth, and the stillness of the cave seemed almost unnatural to him. But it was peaceful, and for now that was enough. Lyle stood and stretched, the weight of his sword feeling heavy on his back. The battle was over, the warden was defeated, but the world beyond the cave still held countless dangers. They couldn't remain here forever. "Azeroth," Sir Lyle said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "What happens now? What are we supposed to do?" Azeroth shifted, his wings rustling softly. "We move forward," he replied, his voice low but firm. "There's nothing left for us here. We've survived. That's all we can do. We find the next journey." Lyle looked out at the open sky through the entrance of the cave. The world was wide and full of possibility, but it also felt daunting. He had spent so long fighting to survive, but now that the war was over, he didn't know what to do with himself. He had come to understand Azeroth's philosophy over time, that survival at its core wasn't about winning battles, but about finding the strength to keep going. But that didn't mean he didn't long for something more. He wanted peace. He wanted purpose. He wanted to believe that all the suffering had been worth it. "And if we can't find it?" Lyle asked, a bitter edge creeping into his tone. "If there's nothing left?" Azeroth's gaze softened, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Then we make something of it, together." The simplicity of the answer settled into Lyle's heart, and for the first time since the battle had ended, he felt a small, hopeful flicker inside of him. They had lost much, but they had not lost each other, and for now, that was enough. It wasn't long before they packed what little supplies they had and began their journey back down the mountain pass, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Sir Lyle carried his sword, but his movements were slower, more deliberate. He no longer felt the sharp drive of duty or the weight of vengeance. There was only the road ahead, and with it the uncertainty of the future. The landscape stretched out before them in a vast, rolling expanse of mountains and valleys. The world felt both familiar and alien, like a land they had once known, but now saw through different eyes. The forests were quieter than they had been before the war, as if the earth itself was recovering from the scars of battle. They walked for hours, taking in the changing scenery. As the sun began to dip behind the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden light, Lyle realized that something within him had shifted. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, they were all still there, but they no longer controlled him. He had been through too much, seen too much, to be ruled by them. Azeroth, walking beside him, seemed to sense the change. The dragon's wings were folded gently at his sides, no longer dragging with fatigue, and his eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. They had both survived the storm, and though the road ahead was unknown, they were ready for whatever came next. As night fell and they set up camp beneath the stars, Lyle found himself staring up at the sky, lost in thought. The fire crackled softly between them, casting long, flickering shadows on the ground. He was no longer a knight bound by a single purpose. He was a man who had lost much, but had found something more important, his own humanity. "What now, Lyle?" Azeroth asked, his voice low but tinged with curiosity. Lyle looked over at the dragon, surprised by the question. He had never known Azeroth to ask such a thing. But there was no uncertainty in the dragon's voice, no fear. There was only the quiet acceptance of whatever the future might bring. "I don't know," Lyle said softly, "but I think I'm finally okay with that. Maybe the future isn't about a destination, but about the journey, about who we become along the way." Azeroth nodded, his gaze softening as he stared into the fire. "I've spent so many years believing that I had to be something more, something beyond what I am. But maybe like you, I've learned that it's enough to simply be, to find peace in the present." The two of them sat in comfortable silence for a long while, the weight of their journey settling over them like a warm blanket. Lyle realized with a quiet sense of certainty that he had changed. The knight who had once been driven by duty and vengeance had given way to a man who had learned to embrace uncertainty, to find solace in the quiet moments of life. And in that peace, in the companionship they shared, he found the strength to face whatever the future held. As the night wore on and the stars burned brightly overhead, Lyle knew that the battles were behind him. But the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always be moments of doubt and fear. But he had Azeroth beside him now, and that was all he needed to face whatever came next. The journey ahead was unknown, but for the first time, Sir Lyle felt ready to embrace it. He had learned that survival was more than just fighting. It was about finding meaning in the journey, in the people who walked beside you. And as long as Azeroth was by his side, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The night settled peacefully around them, and as they drifted off to sleep, the world, though still uncertain, felt just a little bit brighter.